The night was cloaked in a relentless, chilling rain, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes every shadow feel heavier. Water streamed down the cracked asphalt of Main Street, glistening under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. Inside his car, Marcus gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles tense against the worn leather. The soft, rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers battled the steady drizzle, but it couldn't drown out the gnawing unease twisting in his gut. It was too late for anything good to come from this drive home. Exhaustion weighed on him like a soaked blanket after a day that had chewed him up and spit him out. All he wanted was the sanctuary of his small apartment, the creak of his favorite armchair, the hiss of a hot shower, and a few precious hours of silence to stitch his frayed nerves back together. But then, there they were, and blue lights pulsing ominously in his rearview mirror. Cutting through the haze like a predator's eyes, Marcus let out a low, bitter groan under his breath. "Here we go again," he muttered, the words tasting sour on his tongue. His taillights were fine. His plates were clean, had checked them himself just last week. So what was this deep down? He already knew. Driving while black, it wasn't a new story. Not for him. This was an old, familiar script, one he'd played out more times than he cared to count. He eased the car to the shoulder, tires crunching against wet gravel, and positioned his hands deliberately at 10 and 2. The drill was second nature now. Stay visible, stay calm, don't give them a reason. Behind him, the police cruiser rolled to a stop, its engine rumbling like a restless beast. The officer stepped out, a towering figure silhouetted against the flashing lights. His boots splashed through shallow puddles, each step deliberate, heavy with authority. Rain streaked down his broad shoulders, plastering his uniform against his frame. But he didn't seem to care. His face was hard, carved from stone, with eyes that glinted like steel under the brim of his hat. To Marcus, he looked like a man who owned this stretch of roadway, owned this whole damn town, and expected everyone else to bow to his unspoken rule. Marcus's stomach churned as the officer approached, a sour mix of anger and dread bubbling up. He rolled down the window just enough, the cold air rushing in to mingle with the damp heat of his car. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice cutting through the patter of rain like a blade. No hello, no pretense of civility, just a demand, sharp and unyielding. His tone carried an accusation, as if Marcus had already crossed some invisible line. "Good evening, officer," Marcus replied, forcing his voice to stay steady despite the heat rising in his chest. "Can I ask why you pulled me over?" He kept his eyes forward, careful not to provoke, but the question hung in the air like a challenge. The officer's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "You're driving suspiciously slow," he said, spitting the words out like they were an insult. Suspiciously slow. Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The roads were slick with rain, shimmering dangerously under the streetlights. He'd been cautious, deliberate. He'd been smart. But to this man, caution was a crime when it came from someone like Marcus. "It's raining," Marcus said evenly, his gaze flicking to the officer's face. "I'm just being careful." He could feel the weight of the man's stare, probing, searching for something to latch onto. The officer leaned in closer, water dripping from his hat onto the window frame. His breath a stale cloud of coffee and arrogance. "Careful," he drawled, his voice thick with mockery. "You got something to hide in this car, pal." That word pounded like a slap, dripping with condescension. Marcus's heart kicked against his ribs, a frantic rhythm he fought to control. "No, officer," he said, his tone flat, almost to calm. "I don't have anything to hide. Everything's in order." Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the glove compartment, his movements measured like a dancer on a tightrope. One slip, one twitch, and this could spiral into something ugly. He handed over his license and registration, the papers trembling slightly in the damp air. The officer snatched them with a grunt, barely glancing at the documents before turning on his heel and stalking back to his cruiser. Marcus watched him in the side mirror, rain streaking down the glass like tears. He knew what was coming. This wasn't about a ticket or a warning, this was a hunt. The officer would dig, twist, escalate, because that's what men like him did when they smelled power. Marcus's fingers tightened on the wheel, his mind racing. He wasn't just tired anymore, he was angry, a slow burn simmering beneath his skin. When the officer returned, something had shifted. His strides were quicker, his jaw clenched tight, his face flushed with a restless energy. He didn't bother with pleasantries this time. "Step out of the vehicle," he snapped, his voice hard and unyielding, like he was talking to a wall instead of a man. Marcus's brow furrowed, but he kept his tone measured. "What's the reason, officer?" He wasn't about to roll over, not yet. He deserved an answer, even if he knew it wouldn't come. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, each word grinding out like gravel under his boots. His hand hovered near his belt, a subtle threat Marcus couldn't ignore. With a heavy sigh, Marcus pushed the door open and stepped into the rain. The cold soaked through his jacket instantly, plastering his shirt to his skin, but he stood tall, refusing to shrink under the officer's glare. "Open the trunk," the officer ordered, jerking his head toward the back of the car. His tone left no room for debate, but Marcus wasn't letting it slide that easily. "With all due respect, officer, you need a warrant for that," he said, his voice firm but professional. He knew his rights, knew them backward and forward, and he wasn't about to let this man trample them. Without a fight, the officer's face twisted into a grin, sharp and predatory. "See, that's where you're wrong," he said, his voice low and smug. "I can check whatever I damn well please." He didn't wait for a response, brushing past Marcus like he was nothing more than an obstacle. Marcus's blood roared in his ears, a tidal wave of fury he barely held back. "Actually, no, you can't," he said, his words clipped and precise, but the officer ignored him, already fumbling with his key ring as if the car belonged to him. The trunk popped open with a dull thud, and Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't just a violation, it was a reckoning, a moment that had been building for years. The officer rummaged through the trunk with the eagerness of a kid tearing into a Christmas present, his hands brushing aside a spare tire, an old jacket, until they landed on it, a sleek, gray document case tucked into the corner. Marcus had placed it there earlier that evening, a mundane task that now felt like fate slotting into place. The officer froze, his fingers hovering over the case as if it might bite. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. The bravado was gone, replaced by something unsteady. "Personal property," Marcus shot back, his tone sharp enough to cut. But the officer didn't listen. His trembling fingers unlatched the case, flipping it open with a hunger that quickly turned to dread. His eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the papers inside. Marcus watched, a strange cocktail of satisfaction and exhaustion swirling in his chest. He knew exactly what those documents held, knew the weight they carried, and he could see the moment. The officer realized he'd stepped into a trap he couldn't escape. The man's face drained of color, his skin paling to a ghostly white under the rain-streaked glow of his flashlight. His hands shook as he lifted the top sheet, reading the words that spelled his doom. "Notice of termination," Marcus said coolly, leaning against the car with his arms crossed. "Effective immediately, Officer Hendricks." The name rolled off his tongue like a verdict. And for the first time that night, Marcus felt the balance shift. Hendricks's jaw slackened, his lips parting in a silent gasp. The cocky smirk, the swagger, the unshakable confidence, it all crumbled in an instant, leaving behind a man who looked small, fragile, lost. His eyes darted from the paper to Marcus and back again, as if searching for a loophole, a mistake, anything to claw his way out, but there was nothing. The truth stared back at him in stark black ink. His career was over, undone not by a grand conspiracy but by his own arrogance, his own abuse of power. Marcus stood there, rain dripping down his face, and let the moment sink in. This wasn't just about him, it was about every late-night stop, every unwarranted search, every time someone like Hendricks thought the badge made them untouchable. Justice didn't always come swiftly, but when it did, it hit like a thunderclap. Hendricks had wielded his authority like a weapon, oblivious to the consequences. And now those consequences had caught up, cold and unforgiving. Around them, the night pressed in, the rain a steady drumbeat against the silence. A passing car slowed, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene. The officer, hunched and defeated, clutching the papers that had stripped him bare. Marcus, steady and resolute, A man who'd turned the tables not with force, but with truth. The driver, an older woman with graying hair peeking from under a hood, squinted through her window, sensing the weight of the moment before speeding off into the dark. Hendrix's voice broke the stillness, weak and trembling. What is this?" he stammered, as if saying it aloud might undo it. But Marcus didn't answer, not yet. He let the question hang, let the man stew in the wreckage of his own making. This was more than a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a mirror held up to a system that too often let power run unchecked. A lesson carved in the ruins of one man's career. Abuse the scales of justice, and they'll eventually tip against you. Rain streaked down the grimy windows of the precinct, casting jagged shadows across the room as the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The air was thick with the stale scent of coffee and the faint tang of sweat, a testament to the long hours and fraying nerves that defined this place. Hendrix sat slumped at his desk, his broad shoulders hunched over a crumpled piece of paper that trembled in his hands. His fingers, usually steady from years of gripping a badge and gun with unshakable confidence, now shook uncontrollably, betraying the storm brewing inside him. His breath hitched as he muttered under his voice, barely audible over the hum of the station. "Wait a minute, this can't be real." But the truth was sinking in, clawing its way into his mind like a relentless predator, and the color drained from his weathered face, leaving it ashen and hollow. I stood a few feet away, leaning casually against the edge of a desk littered with files and half-empty mugs, my arms crossed as I watched him unravel. The silence stretched between us, heavy and deliberate, a weapon I wielded with quiet satisfaction. Every twitch of his jaw, every flicker of panic in his wide, bloodshot eyes fed a growing sense of triumph deep in my chest. I didn't rush him. I let him stew in it, let the weight of his own actions press down on him until it felt like the room itself was closing in. This was his reckoning, and I intended to savor every agonizing second of it. His gaze darted across the page, the words blurring through the sheen of sweat beading on his forehead. His lips parted, a faint whisper escaping as he read my name, James Peterson, and the reality of who I was crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Do you want to explain?" I said, my voice low and edged with a dark amusement. "Why you thought it was a good idea to trample all over the rights of your new boss?" It wasn't a question that begged an answer. It was a spotlight illuminating his foolishness, and I could see him shrinking beneath it. Hendrik blinked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish yanked from the water, gasping for a lifeline that wasn't there. He wanted a miracle, a way to rewind the clock and erase the arrogance that had led him here. But there was no escaping this, not now. The precinct buzzed faintly, round us phones ringing in the distance, the clatter of keyboards, the occasional bark of laughter from officers oblivious to the drama unfolding in this corner. But for Hendrik, the world had narrowed to the piece of paper in his hands and the man standing before him. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of his mistake with agonizing slowness. He'd been a king in this little kingdom, a cop who thrived on bending rules and flexing power over anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. Now, that illusion was shattering, and the panic blooming in his chest was palpable. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, searching for an excuse, a defense, anything to claw his way out of the pit he'd dug. But there was nothing, just the cold, hard truth staring back at him. "James Peterson," I said again, letting the name hang in the air like a judge's gavel. His face twitched at the sound, a muscle jumping in his cheek as he gripped the paper tighter, its edges crumpling under his sweaty palms. "That's me. And this," I gestured lazily at the document he clutched like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "This is your termination notice." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the silence that followed. Hendrik's jaw tightened so hard I thought it might crack, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to process the blow. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were a chaotic swirl of disbelief and dread, the kind of raw terror that strips a man bare. "I don't understand," he stammered, his voice cracking like thin ice underfoot. "This can't be real. You're not." "I am," I cut in sharply, my tone slicing through his denial like a blade. "I'm exactly who you think I am, Hendrik, your new boss. And you've been a thorn in everyone's side around here for far too long." I stepped closer, my shadow falling over him. and his head jerked back as if he could retreat from the inevitability of it all. "I'm here to clean up this department, and your name-io, it's right at the top of my list." His face crumpled then, like a paper mask folding under pressure. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked smaller, diminished, a far cry from the swaggering figure who'd strutted through these halls barking orders and throwing his weight around. The realization was sinking in, slow and brutal, and I wasn't about to let up. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" I asked, my voice dipping into a mocking lilt as I watched him squirm. "You think that badge gives you a free pass to do whatever the hell you want? That I wouldn't notice, that I didn't see how you've been treating people?" His eyes darted around the room, as if the peeling paint or the flickering lights might offer some salvation. But there was no one coming to his rescue, not this time. His mind scrambled for a foothold, a way to justify the years of intimidation, the petty abuses of power he'd wielded like a club. But the evidence was stacked against him, a mountain of complaints and whispered grievances I'd uncovered in my first week here. He'd crossed too many lines, and now the bill was due. "You don't even know who you've been messing with, Hendrik," I said, my words slow and deliberate, each one driving the nail deeper. "But don't worry, you'll figure it out soon enough." He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His breath hitched, his chest heaving as if the air itself had turned against him. The man who'd once radiated arrogance now looked like a cornered animal, his bravado stripped away, leaving only fear in its wake. The transformation was almost poetic, a living lesson in the fragility of unchecked power. "Please," he finally choked out, the word barely audible, a desperate plea rasping from his throat. "Please don't do this. I didn't know who you were. I didn't. He can fix this." His voice trembled, teetering on the edge of collapse, and I couldn't help the sharp laugh that slipped from my lips. It wasn't humor, it was incredulity, a bitter acknowledgement of how far he'd fallen. "Fix this?" I echoed, my tone dripping with sarcasm as I leaned in closer, my eyes locking onto his. "You think a sorry little apology is going to erase everything you've done? That's not how this works, Hendrik. You don't get to break the law, stomp on people's lives, just because you're too blind to see who's watching." His hands shook harder now, the termination notice quivering between his fingers like a leaf caught in a storm. It was his last tether to the life he'd known, and it was slipping away. "You're not sorry you did it," I added, my voice hardening as I straightened up. "You're sorry you got caught." His face twisted, a mix of panic and desperation flashing across his features. I could see the wheels spinning behind his eyes, the frantic search for a way out. But this wasn't a negotiation. This was justice, cold and unyielding, and he'd brought it on himself. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice so faint it barely reached me. "This job, it's all I have. I need this. I can change. I can do better." His words hung in the air, fragile and pleading, and for a fleeting moment, I almost felt a pang of pity. His face crumpled further, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, a man teetering on the brink of breaking. But then I remembered the ones he'd bullied, the ones he'd silenced, the ones who'd never had a chance to fight back. This wasn't about saving him. This was about stopping him. "Prove it," I said, crossing my arms again, my voice flat and unyielding. "Prove it to someone else, not me." His shoulders slumped further, his body folding in on itself as the fight drained out of him. The rain outside pounded harder against the windows, a relentless drumbeat underscoring the finality of the moment. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my movements slow and deliberate, and dialed a number I'd memorized days ago. The line rang once before a crisp voice answered. "Chief Peterson." "It's me," I said, my tone steady as I kept my eyes on Hendrik. "I've got Officer Hendrik here. Effective immediately. He's terminated. Notify HR and get the paperwork started." Hendrik's head snapped up, his eyes widening to saucers as the words sank in. His mouth opened, a strangled sound escaping as he lurched forward, hands outstretched like he could physically stop what was happening. Wait, you don't have to do this," he stammered, his voice rising in a frantic crescendo. "I can fix this. I'll do anything, just don't." "It's done," I said, cutting him off with a sharpness that brooked no argument. "Pack your things. Turn in your badge and gun by the end of the day. Don't even think about appealing. Complaints against you are airtight." I ended the call with a click, the sound echoing in the space between us like a gunshot. When I looked back at him, Hendrik was frozen, his body rigid as if the weight of his ruin had turned him to stone. The paper in his hand, now soggy from the damp air seeping through the cracked windows, drooped limply, a pathetic symbol of everything he'd lost. His career, his pride, his identity, it was all slipping through his fingers, washed away by the rain and the consequences of his own making. His pale face glistened with sweat, his eyes darting wildly as he tried to grasp the magnitude of his fall. He took a shaky step toward me, his boots scuffing against the worn linoleum, his hands trembling as he held out the termination notice like a white flag. "I didn't mean it," he croaked, his voice breaking under the strain. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. Please just give me a chance. I can change." The desperation in his tone was thick, suffocating. A man clinging to the wreckage of his life with everything he had left. But I'd heard those promises before from others like him, from men who thought a badge was a shield for their sins. They were empty words. Too little and far too late. "Don't even try it," I said, my voice low and final, cutting through his pleas like a guillotine. "You don't get to fix this." He staggered back, his legs unsteady, and for a moment, I thought he might collapse right there on the precinct floor. The rain outside roared on, a fitting chorus to the end of his reign. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about every soul he'd wronged, every life he'd tarnished with his petty tyranny. Justice wasn't a gentle hand, it was a storm, and Hendrik had been caught in its path. As he stood there, a broken figure in a world that no longer belonged to him, the lesson was clear: power, when abused, carries a price, and no amount of pleading could outrun its consequences. The rain poured relentlessly, a cold, unyielding curtain that drenched the world below, turning the asphalt into a slick, reflective mirror of despair. Hendrik stood there, a solitary figure beneath the gray sky, his once proud posture crumbling like a fragile house of cards caught in a gust of wind, his face etched with lines of arrogance and defiance just hours before, now folded inward, collapsing under the weight of his own reckoning. It was as if an invisible hand had seized his features, crumpling them into a tight, pitiful ball. His bravado, his swagger, the illusion of invincibility he'd clung to of it had evaporated, leaving behind a shell of a man who could no longer hide from the truth. I stood a few feet away, my eyes locked on him, unable to tear myself from the spectacle of his unraveling. There was something magnetic about it, something raw and unfiltered, a glimpse into the soul of a person who'd finally run out of lies to tell himself. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice trembling, barely rising above the steady patter of rain against the pavement. It was a plea, fragile and desperate, as though he could shrink himself down, make himself less imposing, less culpable, if only he could find the right words. "This job, it's all I have. If I lose this, I lose everything." His eyes darted toward me, wide and searching, but I didn't answer, not yet. Instead, I let the silence settle between us, heavy and deliberate, a quiet so profound it seemed to echo louder than any shouting match could. It was the kind of stillness that stripped away pretense, that forced him to confront the futility of his excuses. He'd crossed a line too many lines. Realigned now, the consequences were crashing down like the rain soaking through his uniform. He couldn't talk his way out of this one, and deep down, I think he knew it. When I finally spoke, my voice cut through the air, sharp and icy, carrying the weight of every moment that had led us here. "You should have thought about that before you started swinging your badge around, like it was a loaded gun." I didn't raise my tone. I didn't need to. The words landed with precision, each one a cold, deliberate stab at the fantasy he'd built around himself. "You thought you could bully people into submission, scare them until they bent to your will. But that game's over, Hendrik. It doesn't work like that anymore, not for you, not for anyone." He stood there, trembling beneath the downpour, his breaths coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, rivulets streaming down his face, mingling with the faint shimmer of panic in his eyes. I could see a fight draining out of him, seeping away with every drop that hit the ground. His shoulders slumped, his chest caved inward, and his entire being radiated defeat. But it wasn't just defeat I saw. It was something deeper, something more humiliating. This wasn't merely a man losing a battle. This was a man being laid bare, exposed as the coward he'd always been beneath the shield of authority. For years, he'd wielded his power like a club, beating down anyone who dared to question him, convinced he was untouchable. Now, that illusion was dissolving, and the reality of his actions off, who he truly was, stared back at him through the storm. "Do you think this is hard?" I asked, my voice firm, edged with a harshness that wasn't cruel but unyielding. "What about the people you've crushed under your thumb? The ones who couldn't fight back, who didn't have the strength or the means to stand up to you? They've been carrying this weight every day of their lives because of you. But you get to walk away from this. You get to leave it behind and pretend it never happened. They don't have that luxury." My words hung in the air, sharp and accusing, and I watched as they sank into him, each one a stone piling onto the burden he could no longer shrug off. He didn't respond. He couldn't. His lips parted slightly, as if he might muster some defense, some last-ditch effort to salvage his pride, but nothing came. The silence that followed was his confession, his surrender. It was all I needed to hear. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the cold metal slick against my fingers, and dialed the number I'd known I'd have to call eventually. The line rang once, a shrill sound cutting through the rain, before Chief Peterson's voice crackled through, steady and professional, as if this were just another routine day. "Chief Peterson," he said, his tone clipped, businesslike. "It's done," I replied, my voice flat but resolute. "Hendricks finished, effective immediately. Get HR on it and make sure everything's squared away." There was a pause on the other end, a faint hum of acknowledgement, before Peterson's voice returned, calm and measured. "Understood. We'll handle it." I ended the call with a press of my thumb, the screen going dark as I slipped the phone back into my pocket. For a moment, I just stood there, the rain drumming against my jacket, my eyes fixed on Hendrick. I waited for some reaction, some flicker of defiance or regret, but there was nothing. He just stood there, a drenched, broken figure, staring at the ground as if it might open up and swallow him whole. Maybe it already had. I couldn't muster an ounce of pity for him. Every ounce of this downfall, every shred of his humiliation, he'd earned with his own hands. He'd rolled the dice, played the game of power and intimidation, and now the table had turned against him. The price was due, and I wasn't about to soften the blow. "You've got until the end of the day," I said, my voice final, a steel door slamming shut. "Pack your things, turn in your badge and your gun, and don't even think about fighting this. You're done here." His face twisted, a fleeting spasm of disbelief, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave a slow, defeated nod, his shoulders sinking even lower, as if the weight of my words had physically pressed him into the earth. I turned away, my boots splashing through shallow puddles as I made my way back to my car. The rain still fell, a steady rhythm that no longer felt oppressive but cleansing, as if it were washing away the filth of what had just transpired. The storm wasn't a harbinger of doom anymore. It was the aftermath, the quiet exhale after a long-held breath. I reached my car, popped the trunk to toss in my soaked jacket, and slid into the driver's seat, the leather creaking faintly beneath me. I didn't look back, not yet. But as I turned the key, the engine rumbling to life, I caught a glimpse of Hendrick in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved. He stood there, a statue of ruin, the rain pouring over him like a shroud. His face was a mask of shock, the full gravity of his collapse still sinking in. Though I knew it hadn't hit him completely, not yet. It would, though, soon. The soft tap of rain against the windshield filled the car, a muted lullaby that dulled the edges of the world outside. I pulled away from the curb, the tires hissing against the wet pavement, and drove slowly down the street. My eyes flicked to the mirror one last time, Hendrick's figure growing smaller, a lonely silhouette against the storm. I didn't know why I thought he might move, might try to claw back some shred of dignity. But I knew he wouldn't. Not now, not ever. My mind churned as I drove, replaying every detail of the confrontation, the way his voice had cracked, the way his hands had twitched at his sides, the way he'd demanded respect he'd never earned. It was all so vivid, so undeniable. He'd spent years pushing people around, banking on the shield of his badge to protect him, never imagining a day like this would come. But it had, and I'd been the one to deliver it. I thought about the others I'd seen like officers who wore the uniform like a crown, who twisted their authority into a weapon to wield against the vulnerable. The stories echoed in my head, complaints brushed aside, threats whispered in dark corners, lives upended by men who thought they were above the law. I'd watched it unfold too many times, the patterns clear as day. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd always known I'd have to act. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Today had been that day. The moment I'd drawn a line in the sand and refused to let it be crossed again. Hendrik was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a single thread in a tapestry of corruption that had frayed for far too long. This wasn't about him, not really. It was about justice, about consequences, about reminding everyone that power wasn't a free pass to hurt others. As I neared the department, the rain began to ease, the clouds parting just enough to let a sliver of pale light break through. I pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires, and cut the engine. For a moment, I sat there, the silence wrapping around me like a blanket. The adrenaline was gone, the anger too. Just a strange, steady calm remained. I stepped out, the air cool against my skin, and made my way toward the building. Inside, the hallways were dim, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I passed the offices of Collegesum Good. Some questionable, and I knew word would spread soon enough. They'd hear about Hendrik, see what I'd done, and the ripples would begin. Whispers would turn to conversations, and slowly, they'd realize the old ways wouldn't hold anymore. Accountability was coming, and no badge would shield them from it. I reached my office, flicked on the light, and sank into the chair behind my desk. The room was still, almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. My eyes drifted to the stack of papers in front of me, but my thoughts were elsewhere, back on Hendrik, on the rain, on the weight of what I'd set in motion. I wondered how long it'd take him to pack up, to walk out of the department for the last time. I wondered how long it'd take for him to feel the full sting of his choice, not just the loss of his job, but the knowledge that he'd brought this on himself. I didn't pity him. Not for a second. He'd abused his power, trampled on the weak, and now he'd face the fallout. That was justice. That was the lesson. Power without restraint was a house built on sand, and sooner or later, the tide would come in. But even as I sat there, I felt the weight of it too, not guilt, not regret, but the quiet burden of knowing this was just the beginning. One man down didn't fix everything. The road ahead would be long, the battles hard fought, but today had been a start, a damn good one. And as the rain tapered off outside, I couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the storm was finally clearing for me, for the department, for everyone who'd been waiting for the scales to tip back toward right. The city had long been a place where shadows clung to every corner, a sprawling maze of concrete and steel that swallowed hope as easily as it did the daylight. For years, I'd carried a weight inside me, gnawing ache born from the injustices I'd endured. The kind that left scars no one could see. It wasn't just about me, though. It was about everyone else who'd been crushed under the same heavy boot, forced to swallow the bitter taste of fear, shame, and rage simply because of who they were, because of the skin they were born in. I'd vowed to myself that no one else would have to feel that suffocating dread, that no one else would have to shrink under the accusing glares or the cold indifference of a system that was supposed to protect them. That promise had fueled me, driven me to this moment, sitting alone in an office that still smelled faintly of stale coffee and ink. The storm outside had raged all night, a relentless roar of wind and rain battering the windows as if the sky itself was purging something rotten. But now, as dawn crept over the horizon, the clouds parted, and a fragile stillness settled over the city. I leaned back in my chair, the creak of worn leather beneath me a quiet companion to my thoughts. My chest rose and fell with a deep, deliberate breath, the first one in what felt like forever that didn't taste of tension. On the desk in front of me sat a phone, its black surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. My fingers hesitated above it, trembling with the weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't Victor in it yet, but it was a crack in the wall, a sliver of light piercing through the dark, and in that fleeting moment, it was enough. I reached for the phone, my movements slow and purposeful, and dialed a number I'd memorized long ago, one I'd kept tucked away like a lifeline for a day like this. The line rang once, a sharp trill cutting through the silence, before a gruff voice answered. "Peterson," he said, his tone clipped but familiar. The sound of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. "Yeah, it's me," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning beneath it. "Hendricks out. Everything's set. Make sure HR gets it processed right away, no delays." There was a pause on the other end, a brief stretch of quiet that felt heavier than it should have. Then Peterson's voice returned, firm and resolute. "Got it. It's done." The line went dead, and I set the phone down with a soft click, letting my head tip back against the chair. Outside, the last remnants of the storm faded into memory, the sky stretching wide and clear above the city. For the first time in years, I felt the knot in my chest loosen, just a little, like I could finally draw a full breath without the weight of the world pressing down on me. But the days that followed didn't bring the peace I'd hoped for. Hendricks' dismissal should have been a release, a cleansing exhale after holding my breath for so long. Instead, it left me restless, suspended in a strange limbo where relief refused to settle. I kept waiting for something to shift, for the ground to steady beneath my feet, but the air remained thick with unease. The storm might have passed, but its echoes lingered, a low hum of tension that vibrated through the department like a warning. I buried myself in work, drowning in stacks of paperwork that spilled across my desk: reports, memos, files that needed signing. Anything to keep my hands busy, my mind occupied, to outrun the nagging feeling that this was only the beginning. The phone rang incessantly, a constant buzz that pulled me from one task to the next. Officers drifted in and out of my office, their boots scuffing against the worn linoleum as they checked in. Some offered quick nods, their eyes guarded but curious, while others lingered a moment too long, searching my face for answers I wasn't ready to give. There was a new energy in the air, subtle but undeniably mix of wariness and anticipation, like everyone was bracing for the inevitable fallout. I could feel their stares as I moved through the halls, some heavy with newfound respect, others sharp with something closer to fear. I didn't need to hear the hushed conversations to know what they were saying. Hendricks' firing had sent shockwaves through the ranks. A stone dropped into still water, and the ripples were spreading faster than anyone could contain. The truth gnawed at me as I sat there, alone with my thoughts. This wasn't over. Hendrick wasn't the end, was just the first thread pulled from a tapestry of corruption that had been woven into the department for years. He was a symptom, a glaring example of the rot that had taken root, a man who'd wielded his badge like a club, who'd abused the power entrusted to him until it became a weapon instead of a shield. But it wasn't just him. It was the system that had propped him up, the culture that had turned a blind eye, the silence that had let it fester. People had grown so used to it, numb to the injustice, or worse, complicit in it, that they'd stopped seeing it for what it was. That kind of apathy ended now. Not on my watch. The next morning, I walked into the department with my head high, the familiar clamor of voices and rustling papers greeting me like an old friend. But something had shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious, no dramatic confrontations or pointed fingers, but I could feel it in the way people moved around me. A desk officer glanced up as I passed, his pen pausing mid-sentence before he quickly looked away. A pair of patrolmen by the coffee machine fell silent, their laughter dying as I approached. The change was in the air itself, a faint crackle of awareness, like the department was a living thing holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. I caught fragments of their conversations as I made my way through, nothing overt, just whispers carried on the edges of the noise. "Hendricks gone," one voice murmured. "About damn time," another replied, tinged with cautious approval. But there were other tones too, darker ones, laced with unease. "Who's next?" someone muttered, barely audible over the hum of the room. I wanted them to feel that uncertainty. I wanted them to know that the old waste ones, where power was a free pass to bully and break where crumbling. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about reminding every soul in this building that the authority they carried came with a responsibility, not a license to oppress. Justice wasn't just a word to throw around, it was a line in the sand. And I was here to make sure no one crossed it again. I settled into my office, the door clicking shut behind me, and let my gaze drift to the window. The city sprawled out beyond the glass, a patchwork of lives and stories, and for a moment, I let the weight of it all sink into me. Hendrik was gone. The first domino had tipped over, clattering to the ground with a sound that still echoed in my ears. But the real battle one that would define everything was just starting. My phone buzzed sharply against the desk, jolting me from my reverie. The screen lit up with a name I'd been expecting, Chief Peterson. I snatched it up without a second thought, already anticipating the conversation ahead. "Peterson," I said, my tone clipped but firm. "We've got a meeting this afternoon," he replied, his voice as steady as ever, cutting through the static like a blade. "It's time to talk next steps. There's more to clean up than just Hendrik." His words hung there, heavy with unspoken truth. And I didn't answer right away. He was right. Hendrik was just the tip of a much uglier iceberg. The department was a house riddled with termites, and tearing out one rotting beam wouldn't save the structure. It would take time, grit, and a relentless will to rip out every last splinter of corruption. I wouldn't stop until it was done. "I'll be there," I said finally, my voice ringing with a quiet resolve. "We'll get this right." I hung up and leaned back, staring at the cluttered desk before weapons scattered across files. A coffee mug still half full from the morning. The call had been short, but it carried a gravity that settled deep in my bones. This wasn't about paperwork or procedure. It was about action, about ensuring Hendrik's exit wasn't just a hollow gesture to appease the angry. It was about proving that the law wasn't a tool for the powerful to swing at the weak. It was a standard that bound us all, officers included. Justice demanded consequences, and I was ready to see them through. The day stretched on, each hour piling more responsibility onto my shoulders. I lost myself in the work, flipping through case files and scribbling notes until my hand cramped. But it wasn't just about keeping the department running. It was about rebuilding something bigger. Trust, that fragile, elusive thing that had been shattered here long before I'd arrived. It couldn't be fixed with a single firing or a stern speech. Trust was a foundation laid brick by brick, and I was determined to start stacking. No matter how long it took. The clock ticked steadily forward, and by the time afternoon rolled around, I found myself walking toward the conference room, my steps echoing down the hall. The room was smaller than I remembered, its walls scuffed and faded from years of use, but the air inside crackled with a weight that made it feel vast. Peterson was already there, seated at the head of the table, his broad shoulders squared as he shuffled a stack of papers. A handful of other ski players in the department sat around him, their faces a mix of fatigue and resolve. There was Officer Daniels, a weary veteran with graying hair and a perpetual frown, who'd seen more than he ever talked about. Next to him was Lieutenant Carter, a younger woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for asking hard questions. A few others filled out the group, old colleagues and fresh faces alakeel watching me. As I stepped inside, the chatter died instantly, leaving only the faint hum of the overhead lights. No grand entrances, no theatrics, just a room full of people who knew the stakes. I took my seat, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and for the first time since I'd taken this role, I didn't feel like I was trespassing. I belonged here, in this fight, at this table. The pressure was a living thing, pressing against my ribs, but it didn't shake me. Peterson cleared his throat, his gravelly voice cutting through the quiet. "Let's get started." And with that, the focus shifted. It wasn't just about Hendrik anymore. It was about the whole damn mess. Accountability, integrity, digging up the bones of a system that had been broken for too long and setting them right. The meeting stretched into hours, the afternoon bleeding into evening as we pored over the rot that had festered in the department. What started as a plan for next steps turned into something deeper, a reckoning with everything that had been ignored, shoved into dark corners, or buried under layers of excuses. The deeper we dug, the uglier it got. I watched the room closely, noting every twitch and shift. Daniels fidgeted when we brought up old cases, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against the table. Carter leaned forward, her jaw tight, as Peterson listed names, officers with histories of questionable behavior, as he put it. The list was long, too long, and it didn't stop at the street level. This wasn't just about rogue cops like Hendrik. It was in the supervisors who'd looked the other way, the brass who'd signed off on reports they knew were lies. It was a sickness that had spread through every rank. And cutting it out would take more than a scalpel, it'd take a sledgehammer. We can't just target the obvious ones, Peterson said, his voice low but unyielding. Getting rid of Hendrik and calling it quits won't fix this. We need a full sweep top to bottom. We need to clean house. The room went still, the weight of his words sinking in. Everyone understood what he meant. This wasn't a few bad apples spoiling the bunch, it was the barrel itself. Warped and rotting from the inside. I scanned the table, catching the eyes of those I'd fought beside in the past. Daniels looked away, his discomfort plain. Carter met my gaze, her expression fierce and unwavering. For the first time, it felt like we were Al and Edna, just me and Peterson. But the ones who'd stuck around, who'd seen the same ugliness I had, and were ready to do something about it. We need to go back through everything, I said, breaking the silence. Every case, every report, every complaint that got brushed off. We start there. My voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it, a promise to myself and to them. This was about more than punishment. It was about justice, and not the kind that came cheap with a slap on the wrist, but the kind that demanded accountability, that reminded everyone what power was supposed to mean. The lesson was clear: abuse it, and there'd be a price to pay. The meeting ended with no fanfare, just a quiet agreement to keep digging, to keep pushing. As I left the room, the spark of hope I'd felt earlier flickered brighter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I believed we could win it. My voice rang out steady and resolute, but beneath the surface, something new stirred, a flicker of heat, a spark of determination that hadn't glowed so fiercely before. It wasn't just firmness now, it was a fire, a deep-seated conviction that surged through me, catching me off guard with its intensity. We can't let a single detail slip through the cracks, I declared, my words carrying the weight of a vow. Every complaint, every action, every misstep, we're digging into it all. No one walks away unscathed, no one gets a free pass. Across the table, Peterson's eyes met mine, sharp and unwavering. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his jaw tightening as if he, too, felt the gravity of what we were embarking on. It's about time we let the light in, he said, his voice low but firm. If that means tearing open every shadowed corner of this department, then that's what we'll do. The rest of the meeting stretched on as we carved out our battle plan with meticulous care. We laid it all out, an exhaustive audit of every officer's record, a deep dive into the chain of command, and a public pledge to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Words flew back and forth, each one laced with purpose, but beneath the surface, a quiet dread gnawed at me. I knew the real fight wasn't in the planning, it was in the doing. Change was a beast, stubborn and unrelenting, especially when the ones who needed to bend were the same ones clutching the reins of power. As the others filed out of the room, I lingered, letting the silence settle over me like a heavy cloak. The weight of it all pressed down every corrupt thread. Every abused privilege wasn't just a stain on this department, it was a wound on the entire city. The people out there, the ones who looked to us for protection, deserved better than this festering mess, and now it fell to me to unravel it, to stitch it back together. Responsibility wasn't just a title anymore, it was a burden I could feel in my bones. I stepped out of the conference room, my mind still churning, and made my way back to my office. The familiar hum of the building buzzed around, megaphones ringing faintly, footsteps echoing down the hall. But before I could sink into my chair, my phone jolted me back to alertness. The screen flashed a name I hadn't expected: Officer Matthews. A veteran with over 2 decades on the force, Matthews was a man of few words, always keeping his head down and his business to himself. My gut tightened as I swiped to answer, curiosity warring with a flicker of unease. "Chief, it's Matthews," came his voice, hushed and deliberate, like he was measuring every syllable. "We need to talk. It's about Hendrik." I leaned back in my chair, instantly on edge, my fingers tightening around the phone. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my tone even, though a thread of tension wove through it. "What about him?" There was a pause, a faint rustle on the line, as if he was checking his surroundings. Then he spoke again, his voice dropping lower still. "I've been poking around, Chief, and there's more to Hendrik than we thought. It's not just what we've seen, it's bigger. You need to know what he's tangled up in. It's a network, The words hit me like a punch to the gut, a cold knot forming deep in my stomach. I'd had my suspicions about Hendrik's heavy-handed arrests, the whispers of brutality, but a network? That was a different beast entirely, something sprawling and sinister. "I'll meet you," I said, already on my feet, snatching my jacket from the back of the chair. "Where?" "Same place as always," Matthews replied, cryptic but familiar. "We'll talk then." The line went dead, leaving me standing in the dim light of my office, my thoughts racing like wildfire. Matthews wasn't one to exaggerate. If he said it was big, it was. I trusted him, his instincts. His quiet resolve about this felt like stepping into a storm I couldn't yet see. I headed out to the spot we'd used before, a small, unassuming diner perched just beyond the city limits. It was the kind of place that thrived on its unanimated red booths, chipped formica tables, and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. The air smelled of stale coffee and fryer grease, a comforting mundanity that clashed with the tension coiling inside me. Matthews was already there, tucked into the back corner, his broad frame hunched over a steaming mug. His eyes flicked up as I approached, scanning the room with the wariness of a man who'd seen too much. I slid into the booth across from him, my pulse thrumming in my ears. "What's this about, Matthews?" I asked, keeping my voice low. A murmur beneath the diner's soft clatter. "What haven't you told me?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug as he cast another quick glance around. Then he leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper, each word heavy with implication. "It's a ring, Chief. Hendrik wasn't just flexing his badge on the streets. He's been working with other Sither officers. They're deep in it, drugs, protection rackets, the works. It's been running for years." The air seemed to thicken around us, my breath catching as his words sank in. Ice crept through my veins, chilling me to the core as my mind scrambled to process it. Corruption wasn't new, but this was a hydra, a sprawling, multi-headed monster. Who else? I pressed, fighting to keep my voice steady, though my heart pounded against my ribs. "That's the kicker," Matthews said, his eyes darkening. "It's not just Hendrik. There are higher-ups and on-it people we can't touch, or at least they think we can't. It's all connected, and it's bigger than we ever imagined." I leaned back, the cracked vinyl of the booth creaking under me as the enormity of his revelation settled in. This was the moment I'd been bracing for, the tipping point where suspicion hardened into truth. But the path ahead was a minefield. Those involved weren't just grunts, they were power players, entrenched and untouchable, or so they believed. Going after them would be like storming a fortress with a toothpick. Yet there was no turning back. Justice wasn't negotiable, no matter how deep the rot went. "We're taking them down," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, firm and unyielding. "We'll do it clean, but I need everything you've got: names, details, proof. All of it." Matthews nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "I've got it, Chief. But watch your back. This runs deep. I've got eyes everywhere. Don't drop your guard." I stood, the weight of the fight ahead pressing down like a storm cloud. But retreat wasn't in me. This city, this department, deserved more than a legacy of abuse and betrayal. I'd see it through, no matter the cost. The days that followed blurred into a haze of sleepless nights and relentless digging. Matthews had handed me a dossier that felt like a live grenade: names, dates, connections that painted a picture so grotesque it turned my stomach. I pored over it in my office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I sifted through reports, photos, and informant statements. Each piece was a dagger, sharper and more damning than the last. Officers taking bribes, tipping off criminals, shielding drug dens. It wasn't just Hendrik's brutality anymore. It was a web, intricate and vast, stretching from the beat cops to the brass. The higher-ups I'd once respected, men and women who'd worn their authority like a badge of honor, were implicated too. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, not from fear but from a fury I could barely contain. How had this been allowed to fester? People had non-suspected, at least, and yet the silence had held, letting the cancer spread until it choked the life out of everything we stood for. The lesson here wasn't just about catching the guilty. It was about what happened when power went unchecked, when those meant to uphold justice twisted it into a tool for their own gain. Every name on those pages was a betrayal, not just of me or the department, but of every person who'd ever trusted us. I couldn't do it alone, though. No one could dismantle a machine this vast single-handedly. So I called in a handful of officers I knew I could count on, people like Lopez, a weary, sharp-eyed detective with a moral compass that never wavered, and Carter, a gruff old-timer who'd seen enough to know when silence wasn't an option. They sat across from me in a cramped, windowless room, their faces etched with the same mix of disbelief and resolve I felt. "We're going deeper," I told them, spreading the files across the table. "We need evidence, hard, irrefutable proof. I don't care how long it takes. We're cleaning this place out." Later that week, I met Matthews again, this time in a derelict warehouse on the edge of town. Far from prying eyes, the air was thick with dust and the faint tang of rust, the shadows stretching long across the concrete floor. He handed me another stack of files, his hands steady but his eyes haunted. "I've been tracking them," he said, his voice a hushed rasp. "Names, dates. Even some audio. They're good, Chief, but they're sloppy too. They think they're invincible." I flipped through the pages, my pulse racing as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a cleanup anymore, it was a reckoning. The higher-ups, the ones pulling strings from cushy offices, had underestimated us. They'd grown careless, drunk on their own power, and that was their mistake. "We've got the edge," Matthews added, leaning closer. "They don't know we're this close. But when they figure it out, they'll hit back hard." I met his gaze, the fire in me burning brighter. "Let them try," I said. "We're not stopping until it's done." The real war had just begun, and I was ready to fight it, to tear down the rotten tree, root and branch, and plant something better in its place. As I stepped out into the chilly night air, a prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck, as though invisible eyes were boring into me. Each footfall toward my car echoed with a quiet dread, and I couldn't stop myself from casting quick, nervous glances over my shoulder. This wasn't irrational fear gnawing at me, wasn't some paranoid fool jumping at shadows. No, I had every reason to feel this way, every reason to tread carefully. The people I was up against were ruthless, driven by a single-minded determination to shield their crooked empire. They wouldn't think twice about silencing anyone who dared to threaten it. And now, I was the one with a target painted squarely on my back. But that didn't terrify me, it really. What truly sent a shiver down my spine was the thought of letting it all go, of turning a blind eye while these parasites continued to prey unchecked, all because no one had the spine to stand up to them. As I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key, my mind churned with a storm of thoughts, each one more restless than the last. The drive home stretched out before me, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white. But the closer I got to my apartment, the heavier the weight of this fight settled on my shoulders. This wasn't just about tidying up a messy department or rooting out a few bad seeds. This was war against a shadowy network that had sunk its claws into everything I'd sworn to protect, and it had been that way for far too long. I couldn't shake the gnawing question: what would this cost me, my career, my peace of mind? The people I held dear, how much would I have to sacrifice to see this through? When I finally stumbled into my apartment, exhaustion clung to me like damp clothes. I collapsed onto the edge of my bed, my gaze falling to the stack of files Matthews had slipped me earlier that day. Those pages were a Pandora's box, brimming with secrets I wasn't sure I was ready to face. My phone buzzed sharply on the nightstand, snapping me out of my haze. I reached for it, my fingers trembling just slightly, and saw Peterson's name flashing on the screen. For a heartbeat, I hesitated, a flicker of doubt holding me back. Then I answered, forcing my voice to steady itself as I said, "Peterson." His tone cut through the line, low and grave, like a man carrying bad news he didn't want to deliver. "We need to talk," he said. "I've got a lead. One of our own isn't on it." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. I'd known this moment was coming, had braced myself for it in the quiet corners of my mind. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way I hadn't expected. "Who?" I managed to ask, my throat tight. "Officer Stevens," Peterson replied, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "I've got evidence, and it's ugly. We need to move fast before he catches on." Silence stretched between us as I processed it, the name sinking in like a stone. Stevens, one of my own, a man I'd trusted, worked beside for years, shared coffee with on late-night shifts. The sting of betrayal sliced through me, sharp and bitter, but I couldn't let it show, not now. Not when there was no time to wallow. "We'll handle it," I said, my voice turning to steel. "Let's move quick. I'm done letting this fester." Peterson grunted his agreement, and the call ended, leaving me alone with the echo of my resolve. I leaned back in the chair, a tide of anger and determination crashing over me. This wasn't just the start of a fight, it was a vow. I wouldn't sleep that night, not after what Peterson had dropped in my lap. Stevens's face haunted me, flickering through my memories as I tried to pinpoint any hint, any clue I'd missed. Had there been a smirk I'd overlooked, a glance that lingered too long, nothing came to mind. He'd always been steady, dependable, the kind of guy you'd call a friend without a second thought. Now, it felt like every moment we'd shared was a lie, a mask he'd worn to keep me in the dark. Betrayal wasn't just a personal wound, it was the lifeblood of this department. Coursing through its veins the deeper I dug, I wanted to turn away, to pretend I could unhear Peterson's words and go back to blissful ignorance. But that wasn't who I was. People were counting on me, faceless, voiceless people who'd suffered under this corruption for too long. I had to be the one to fix it, no matter how much it tore me apart. Morning found me hunched over my desk, the files spread out like a battlefield before me. Each page I turned felt heavier than the last, the truth sinking its teeth deeper into my resolve. Stevens's involvement wasn't just a shock, it was a mirror, reflecting a system so rotten it had let men like him flourish unnoticed. How many times had I let little things slide, chalked them up to keeping the peace? The realization twisted in my chest. This wasn't about one man. It was about a culture, a suffocating web of silence, fear, and complicity that had taken root while I wasn't looking. Stevens wasn't alone. There were others out there, hiding behind badges and fake smiles, waiting to be unmasked. I was standing at the edge of something massive, ready to rip it all apart. But the sheer scale of it left me reeling. I couldn't do this alone. Later that morning, I tracked down Peterson, needing to see him face to face. His office was a cramped, dimly lit space, the kind of place that smelled faintly of stale coffee and regret. When I walked in, I caught the exhaustion etched into his face, deep lines round his eyes, a weariness that mirrored my own. "Peterson," I said, dropping into the chair across from him, my voice hushed but firm. "We've got to move fast. Stevens isn't the only one. This goes deeper than we thought." He stared at me, his gaze steady but troubled, as if he was still wrestling with the scope of it all. Then he sighed, dragging a hand across his stubbled jaw. "I know," he admitted, "but we can't just charge in blind. We don't know who's clean and who's dirty yet. We need every shred of proof before we make a move." He was right, and I hated it. This wasn't about swinging a hammer and smashing the problem to pieces. It was about precision, about building an airtight case so the guilty couldn't slither away. The department was a nest of vipers, full of people who thought they were above the law, and they'd fight tooth and nail to keep their power. "We start with everyone," I said, leaning forward. "No one gets a pass. We dig until we've got it all." Peterson nodded, a flicker of resolve breaking through his fatigue, and together we started mapping out a plan. It wouldn't be easy gathering intel, lining up every detail, all while the clock ticked louder with each passing hour. The stakes were sky high, but there was no turning back. This was about dismantling a machine that had thrived in the shadows for too long, a machine that mocked the very idea of justice. The day dragged on, and I found myself back at my desk, surrounded by a fortress of paperwork that seemed to grow taller by the minute. My phone buzzed again, jolting me out of my spiraling thoughts. It was Matthews, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got a problem," he said. "Stevens is twitchy. He's been acting off, making moves he shouldn't. I think he knows we're onto him." I shot up from my chair, adrenaline surging. "What kind of moves?" I pressed, hard to pin down. Matthews replied, frustration seeping into his tone. "But he's talking to people he's got no business with. I'd bet he's trying to cover his ass." I cursed under my breath, the room suddenly feeling too small. Stevens sniffing around was the last thing we needed. I had to stay in the dark, oblivious. "While we tighten the noose, we take him down now," I said, my voice hard as iron. "We can't wait. Matthews didn't hesitate. "I'm on it. I'll watch him close any big moves. You'll know." The line went dead, and I started pacing, my boots scuffing against the worn floor. Time was slipping through our fingers, and every second gave Stevens a chance to bury his tracks deeper. That night, sleep was a distant dream. My mind churned relentlessly, circling back to Stevens. What had he done? How far did his corruption stretch? Was he a puppet or a puppet master in this twisted game? The questions gnawed at me, each one a splinter under my skin. If I didn't act fast, this whole operation could collapse like a house of cards. And the deeper I waded into this mess, the more dangerous it became. I grabbed my phone again, dialing Peterson with a sense of urgency I couldn't shake. "P," I said when he picked up, my voice sharp. "We're moving on Stevens. No more waiting, shifting, and we've got to hit him now." There was a pause on the other end. A heavy silence as Peterson weighed the risks. "All right," he said at last, his tone resolute. "Tomorrow, we do this clean." I hung up, my pulse hammering in my ears. Tomorrow wasn't just another day, it was the breaking point. The moment where we'd either win or watch it all burn. When morning broke, it came too fast. The weight of what lay ahead pressing down on me like a storm rolling in. My head buzzed with a chaotic mix of plans and fears, but there was no room for doubt now. Taking Stevens down wasn't optional, it was survival. He couldn't be allowed to slip away, to erase his sins and leave us scrambling. I met Peterson before the sun had fully risen, the department still half asleep around us. We couldn't risk him seeing us coming, couldn't give him a single inch. Peterson stood across from me, his face set in a mask of quiet steel, the kind of look that told me he knew what was at stake. "Everything's ready," he said, his voice low and steady. "We go in hard, no second guessing." I nodded, my jaw tight. "Let's end this." Stevens's betrayal wasn't just a personal blow, it was a glaring lesson in justice, and the rot that festers when power goes unchecked. Every step we took now was a strike against that corruption, a reckoning for the system that had let it thrive. The consequences of their abuse were coming due, and I'd make damn sure they paid in full. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. I stood there, my hands steady but my mind racing, knowing there could be no missteps tonight. Every decision had to be sharp, deliberate, unflinching like a blade slicing through doubt. The operation was a tightrope walk over a chasm. One wrong move and we'd plummet, losing everything we'd fought to uncover. Failure wasn't an option, not now. Not when the truth had finally clawed its way into the light after years of being buried under layers of deceit. I glanced at Peterson, his face etched with quiet resolve, and kept my voice low, almost a whisper. As I asked, "Any last-minute changes?" he shook his head, his tone steady as stone. "No, we're solid. The team's primed, backups in place, and we've got eyes locked on Stevens. The second he steps out that door, we move." I nodded, drawing in a slow, deep breath, trying to loosen the knot of tension tightening in my chest. It wasn't fearing it exactly. I'd faced darker nights than this, stared down chaos, and walked away intact. But this was different. Stevens wasn't just a name scratched on a list, another faceless target in a long line of busts. He was a man I'd trusted, a brother in arms I'd once believed stood shoulder to shoulder with me in the fight for something right. Now, that trust was a bitter taste in my mouth, and I was the one gearing up to drag him into the abyss. The betrayal stung, a dull ache I couldn't shake, but I shoved it down deep. Emotions like that were a luxury I couldn't afford net when justice hung in the balance. Not when the consequences of letting him slip away could ripple out and drown us all. We ran through the plan one last time, mapping out every detail with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Who'd take the lead? Who'd hold the perimeter? Where each shadow would flee was a choreography of controlled chaos, and it had to be flawless. "Once we're in, no one walks away until we've got it all," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs, firm as iron. Peterson met my gaze, his nod quick and certain. "Understood. We'll keep it tight, surgical, no collateral damage." His words carried a weight of their own, a promise to hold the line between order and recklessness. I grabbed my jacket, the leather cool against my skin, and headed for the door. Words were spent. Now it was time to let actions speak. The staging area buzzed with quiet energy as we arrived, a hive of anticipation humming beneath the surface. I could feel the burden of it all pressing down on men at just the weight of the raid, but the personal stakes twisting like a knife in my gut. Stevens wasn't some distant crook I could write off with a shrug. For years, we'd shared the grinned late nights, bad coffee, the unspoken bond of the badge. And now, I was the one about to snap cuffs on his wrists. It wasn't just a betrayal of him. It felt like a betrayal of what I'd thought we stood for. But loyalty, that was a fragile thing, easily shattered when someone traded their principles for power. Stevens had crossed that line, and not just with a single Steve leapt into a cesspool of corruption. So deep I could barely see the bottom. Letting him walk wasn't an option. Justice demanded more. The team fanned out, faces taut with focus, each member a cog in this machine we'd built. I caught glimpses of their expression, some steely, some flickering with uneasy, and knew they felt the stakes too. This wasn't a routine takedown. Stevens had connections, a web of allies who'd fight tooth and nail to shield him. Intimidation wasn't my style, though. I had a job to do, and if I faltered, no one else would pick up the pieces. My phone buzzed, a sharp jolt against my thigh, and I fished it out. Matthew's voice crackled through, urgent and clipped. "He's moving. Leaving the house now. You're clear." My pulse kicked up a notch. "Copy that," I shot back. "Stay tight on him, don't let him vanish." I pocketed the phone and signaled the team, a silent command rippling through the group. Speed and precision were our weapons now. We closed in on Stevens' house, the night wrapping around us like a shroud. Adrenaline surged through my veins, a familiar fire that sharpened every sense. The air was thick, charged with the promise of confrontation, and I had to wrestle down the impulse to charge in blind. One slip, one hasty move, and the whole operation could collapse like a house of cards. Focus was my anchor. We reached the perimeter, and I gave the signal, quiet, subtle. A flick of my hand. The team moved like phantoms, slipping into position around the house. Through the window, I caught Stevens' silhouette, pacing restlessly, his broad shoulders hunched as if he could feel the noose tightening. He had no idea we were there, no clue his world was about to shatter. "On my mark," I murmured to Peterson, who stood close enough for me to see the sweat beading on his brow despite the cool night. "We going hard, fast, no obstacles." He gave a curt nod, his jaw tight. The seconds dragged on, each one a slow drip of eternity. Patience had never been my strength, but tonight it was a necessity I couldn't ignore. Timing was everything. Then the moment Brochet raised my hand, a silent now, and the team exploded into action. Doors crashed open, boots hit the floor, and I was right behind them, heart pounding in my ears. Stevens spun around, his face a mask of shock, eyes wide as realization crashed over him. Too late. We had him pinned before he could blink. "Stevens, you're under arrest," I said, my voice steady as granite despite the storm churning inside me. He gaped, mouth working soundlessly, a fish floundering on dry land. Then his voice broke through, trembling, desperate. "Please, you don't get it. I wasn't alone in this. They forced me. I didn't have a choice." I shook my head, cutting him off cold. "That's not how this works. You chose your path, and now you pay for it." His eyes dropped, defeated, and for a fleeting second, pity flickered in me, but it vanished as fast as it came. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the rot he'd helped spread, the betrayal of everything we'd sworn to uphold. Justice wasn't personal. It was absolute. As we marched him out, the team flanking us like silent sentinels, I scanned their faces. The operation had gone off without a hitch, a rare victory in a war that never seemed to end. But this was just the opening salvo. Stevens was in custody, but the shadows he'd danced with still lurked out there, waiting. The ride back to the station was a quiet void, the city blurring past in streaks of rain and neon. I sat up front, thoughts tumbling over each other like stones in a riverbed. Stevens sat in the back, head bowed, a man already half broken. We had the evidence files, recordings, enough to bury him, but the weight of it all pressed heavier than I'd expected. This wasn't just about one dirty cop. It was about a system riddled with cracks, a web of lies spun by those who'd twisted power into a weapon. Stevens' face flashed in my mind, shock giving way to denial, then that pathetic plea for mercy. He'd tried to shift the blame, to paint himself as a puppet with no strings of his own. It was a tired song, one I'd heard too many times from too many mouths. Every cop who'd ever dipped their hands in the muck sang it. It wasn't me. I had no choice, but choices were all we had, and Stevens had made his. Chasing power until it consumed him. The lesson burned clear of us, your authority, and the fall would be merciless. Dawn crept over the horizon as we pulled into the station, casting the world in muted grays and blues. The officers waiting there watched Stevens with a mix of relief and suspicion, their whispers a low hum in the air. Some had worked with him, laughed with him, trusted him. Now, that trust was ash, and I could see the unease spreading like a slow poison. Peterson caught my eye as we stepped inside, his silence louder than words. We both knew it. Stevens was just the beginning. We dig into everything, I said, voice low but unyielding. Every file, every contact, no more half measures. We root this out, or it festers. He nodded, grim but resolute. Time's not on our side. If he's got people inside, they'll move quick. The hours that followed were a grueling slog interrogations, paper trails, dead ends. Stevens didn't break easy. Every word was a dodge. Every answer a shield for the bigger fish he swam with. But as the sun climbed higher, one truth settled in my bones. This wasn't about him anymore. He was a thread in a tapestry of corruption, and pulling it would unravel something vast and ugly. Justice wasn't just cuffing one man, it was dismantling the machine that had let him thrive. The consequences of power unchecked were laid bare in his trembling excuses, and I'd be damned if I let it stand. The air in the interrogation room hung heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken truths and the faint hum of tension that buzzed beneath every word. Stevens sat across from me, his posture rigid, his jaw tight, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering with the kind of fear that comes from knowing the walls are closing in. He wasn't the mastermind, not by a long shot. Up above him loomed others, shadowy figures who wielded far greater power, pulling strings from darkened corners for years. Stevens was just a piece on their chessboard, a pawn who'd deluded himself into thinking he could outmaneuver the game. By the time I pushed my chair back and stood, exhaustion had seeped into my bones, my mind a storm of fragmented thoughts racing to stitch together the jagged edges of what we'd uncovered. The evidence was damning: photographs, recordings, paper trails, but it was a single thread in a sprawling tapestry of corruption. To unravel the whole network, we needed more names, confessions, someone willing to step out of the shadows and point us toward the heart of it all. As I stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows on the worn linoleum floor. Matthews was waiting there, his broad frame leaning against the wall, arms crossed. His face was a mask of quiet intensity, but his eyes burned with something urgent, something that made my stomach twist before he even spoke. He didn't rush into it. Matthews never did, but when his voice finally broke the silence, it was low, deliberate. "We've got a problem," he said, glancing down the empty corridor as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I've been tracking some of Stevens's contacts. He's been whispering to people inside the department. They're starting to catch on." The words landed like a punch, heavy and unyielding, and for a moment I froze, letting their meaning sink in. This wasn't just about the handful of crooked officers we'd pegged. It was bigger, ugly arrow web of complicity stretching through the ranks, woven into the very culture of the place. These weren't isolated bad apples. They were symptoms of a system that thrived on silence, on power twisted and abused until it festered into something monstrous. I clenched my fists, frustration boiling up inside me until it tightened my throat. "We don't have time to tiptoe around this," I snapped, my voice sharp with the strain of the day. "We need to move, now." Matthews's gaze hardened, his brow furrowing as he studied me. He shifted his weight, the scuff of his boots against the floor echoing faintly in the stillness. "I get it," he said, his tone measured but firm. "But we've got to be smart about this. We're not just chasing Stevens anymore. This thing gets deeper than we thought. One wrong step, and we lose it all." His words hung between us, a sobering counterweight to the fire raging in my chest. He was right, damn it. Caution was our shield, but hesitation could be our downfall. Every second we delayed handed those bastards more time to tighten their grip. to bury their tracks beneath layers of influence and fear. I turned away, my mind already churning through the next move, the next risk. This wasn't going to be clean or simple like never had been, but it was the only path forward. The system had to bend, had to break if we were ever going to reclaim what it was meant to stand for. Weeks bled into one another. Each day a grueling marathon of chasing leads down dark alleys, both literal and figurative. Every name we pried loose, every scrap of evidence we unearthed, dragged us closer to the truth. But it also laid bare the sheer scale of the rot. The precinct, once a towering symbol of order, felt more like a decaying fortress, its walls cracked and stained by decades of unchecked power. This wasn't a flaw in the design, it was the design itself, corruption baked into the foundation. Abuse of authority not as an exception, but as the rule. Dismantling it meant tearing down everything it had propped up, and that weight pressed on me every sleepless night, every bleary-eyed morning spent poring over files. Matthews stuck by my side through it all, his steady presence a lifeline in the chaos. He wasn't just a partner anymore, he was a brother in arms, his quiet resolve a mirror to my own stubborn determination. But even he couldn't hide the toll it took. I saw it in the lines etching deeper into his face, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was looking. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. This fight wasn't just about locking up dirty cops or airing out crimes buried in shadow. It was about something far greater, building a trust that had been shattered, proving to the people the system was supposed to protect that justice wasn't a hollow word. It was about showing that even when the odds towered over us, like an iceberg lurking beneath the surface, change was possible, but only if we had the guts to force it. Stevens's arrest was the first domino, his fall setting off a cascade that rippled through the department. One by one, officers who'd strutted through those halls like untouchable kings found themselves stripped of their badges, their smug grins replaced by the pale shock of accountability. The fortress began to fracture, its once impenetrable walls splitting under the pressure of truth. But no one pretended it was over. We'd chipped away at the surface, sure, but the roots ran deep, and I knew in my gut that this war would stretch on long after I was gone. Those at the top finally grasped that no title, no rank, could shield them from the law. Standing at the front of the department one last time, I let my gaze sweep over the sea of face, some wary, some defiant, a few flickering with something like hope. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, and the faint rustle of uniforms shifting uncomfortably. I thought of Stevens, how he'd sat in that interrogation room believing his power would save him. It hadn't. His career was ash, his freedom caged, his name a stain no amount of bravado could scrub clean. For me, the cost was different, but no less steep. I'd lost the naive faith I'd once carried, the belief that the badge alone stood for something pure. But in its place grew something fiercer, a spark of hope, fragile but unyielding. Hope that this cycle of corruption could be shattered. Hope that those willing to stand up, to bleed for what was right, could tip the scales even when the deck was stacked against them. And that's the truth I clung to through it all. The hardest fights are the ones that strip you bare, that demand every ounce of your strength and leave you raw. But they're the ones that matter most. When we stare into the abyss of injustice, when we claw our way toward what's right even as it feels like the ground's crumbling beneath us, we're winning something. Every inch we gain toward accountability, toward a justice that isn't just a whisper, but a roar that's a triumph. No matter how small it seems in the moment, change doesn't crash down like a tidal wave. It builds, brick by quiet brick, in the choices we make, the battles we refuse to abandon. Stevens learned that lesson the hard way, his arrogance undone by the very system he'd exploited. For me, it was a lesson in resilience, in the slow, brutal beauty of fighting for something bigger than myself. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to turn the tide on, determined step at a time.